Do you think that maybe that working class upbringing and that kind of environment, you mentioned before we started growing up in Liverpool, and those values, have they enabled you to become a better practitioner within your current roles today?
Well, I always have this theory about people in general, whereby we have a world of experts, people who study, and I'm very much a fan. I think that everybody should study something, not necessarily go to university or anything like that. I think there's many different ways of studying, whether that be practical, hands-on, whether that be studying from books, so to say. But I think that what happened for me from an early age is that it was almost a necessity to understand, as a matter of, in a way, get around some of the obstacles I had. And as I grew up in an environment which was working class, it gave me certain advantages. And I think that we've sort of lost that in modern day society, whereby the best teachers are often people who've went through similar experiences as yourself, whereby they understand what's happening and they can relate to you. In psychology, we have this theory that you cannot empathize unless you've lived the similar or the same experience. You can sympathize, but you can't empathize. And I think that I'm able to connect with players in a different way because I can really empathize where they're coming from. Now, of course, modern day literature, there's just been a book written by a guy who talks about the NBA, and he talks about how the majority of the NBA stars are actually from middle-class families, because those middle-class families are actually enabling them to practice, to go to practice, to have that support network. However, I think that here in Europe, especially in certain countries, we still have those fertilized zones whereby working class kids are playing sport and do need someone they can relate to.
So do you think it's a lived experience that's key then within the area of maybe mindset and psychology to help them with maybe obstacles that might become apparent during the journey of a young footballer, as well as maybe a higher end footballer as well?
100%. I think that's why there's so many ex-professionals in the game who are considered at such a high echelon, because there's plenty of coaches in the world who are as good, if not better coaches than ex-players. However, the ex-players, not all of them, but a certain percentage, will have the ability to understand what the player is thinking at that moment in time. So, therefore, they're able to guide them through in a more reasonable way. Of course, there's the historic stories of coaches like, or ex-players like Glenn Hoddle turning up to training, putting the ball down at a free kick practice and just saying, this is how you do it, and putting it in the top corner, of course. However, there are lots and lots of stories of ex-professionals, especially players who put themselves in different environments, such as your Xabi Alonso's or your Zinedine Zidane's or your Ancelotti's, who are able to connect with players and guide them. And then underneath them have the staff who can, as all of those managers did, guide through the training and get to those small details, or as we say in Spanish, matices, the small parts that really make the difference in training.
So let me bring you back to the beginning then, Kris. So you mentioned obviously your family upbringing and then being inspired to think about football and think about different people. Where did it start for you? How did your journey begin then in terms of education and understanding well-being, psychological factors, understanding practice? Because there might be people listening and watching this that might be inspired by your journey so far, and they might want to understand kind of the underlying elements that have enabled you to get to where you are so far during your career. Can you just elaborate on how that began for you?
Yeah, so I was very much a latchkey kid, which is the expression that means go out and just live. Go out, live, go experience the world. So I would leave the house at 9 or maybe earlier and come back at 9. And that might not sound related to psychology, but it really is, because in the areas that I grew up, which were quite lower class and somewhat underclass, whereby people are almost trapped in this never-ending cycle of not being able to escape the situation that they're in, and some some being quite happy where they are, and I have no comments about that. I think that everybody has a different journey. You learn very quickly how to negotiate difficult characters. You learn very quickly how to negotiate, how to talk to, how to behave around characters or people who are or can be violent or could be involved in certain types of activities. So my upbringing was very difficult in that regard. However, it taught me a huge amount about how to work with different people. Taught me how to negotiate difficult head coach, for example. A lot of the time I hear stories, well, this head coach is difficult to work with. And quite often I laugh because I think, no, they're not. They're not. In reality, compared to the things that someone from my background has went through, that's not a difficulty. It's just someone with strong opinions. So as I grew up moving through this environment, I decided from a very early age that I was going to go to university. I was just in that generation whereby the government was encouraging people to go to university, but at the same time, the helps that were given weren't going to put you in severe debt, severe repercussions down the line. Now, I still have a high amount of debt. However, it wasn't something that was keeping me at bay, shall we say. So I decided very early on. I studied very well. I was a naughty student in school. I was thrown out of school quite a few times, not permanently, luckily. So I understand those kids very well. I understand what they're going through. I understand, when I have a player who is having a little bit of a difficulty in school, they say, you don't understand. I say, yeah, I do. I usually do, because I've been there. As that went on, I then decided to go to university, completed my A-levels, spent an extra year completing my A-levels just because I didn't have that structure of study. I didn't have that. I had to build that within myself and build those structural layers in order to be able to find the place to sit down to study, because that wasn't at home and I never had that availability. And that sounds such a small thing, right? A table to go home and put a book on. Sounds such a small thing, but we just didn't have that table. And if we did with 5 sisters, well, you can imagine it wasn't a space that would be occupied with a book. So when I decided to take that journey, I fully committed to it. I had friends at the time who were on the wrong path, and I had to separate from them, and that was all very traumatic as well. Because as you can imagine, your childhood friends, your entire life, constantly knocking at the door. Where's Kris? Where's Kris? Where's Kris? And I think that it's something that I was lucky. I was lucky to go the way I did. I was lucky to go the way I did to university. I was lucky to end up in a situation where I had 1 or 2 people guiding me. And I think everybody needs that 1 or 2 people guiding them.
When you're in that situation at university, what's the kind of the incentive? Obviously, you mentioned the penny drops a little bit, and you have a drive to maybe escape certain realities that you're growing up in. And it's kind of a famous quote: "If you're in the jar, you can't see the label." And it's a little bit like that with you, in terms of you trying to understand and value that education's important for where you want to go. How do you funnel those values then into football then? So, you mentioned your lived experiences, and you mentioned, very out part of the community, understanding people, understanding individuals, difficult individuals. How do you funnel that into football then? Can you reflect on maybe your first experience and how you maybe have had to maybe shift your mindset to enable practice to be effective?
Yeah, 100%. So I think one of the first experiences was, whilst I was at uni, I did a little bit of coaching just in a local club. And one of the first experiences was asking a player to do something and immediately being told to F off. Right? Now, most coaches in this instance, most people will go immediately authoritarian. But what we don't understand is these kids who come from difficult backgrounds, that's all they've ever known. That's all they've ever known is, I react this way, and this this is the result. So one of the first things I learned in coaching was the ability to create environments where kids wanted to be, of all ages, where they would turn up and they would want to be. And especially young men, once you give them structure, strict structure with love, the results are incredible. The results are outstanding. So one of the things we used to do was have completely random allocations of prizes within training. What's a prize within training? What the players want to do? Well, shoot, score. It sounds basic, but it really is true. So you see a lot of coaches, they will at the end of training, they'll do a shooting drill. So what I would do is I would have a drill, and then if things were going really, really great, I would stop it automatically, and there'd be another drill right next to it, which was a shooting drill. I'd say, right, this is going great, and they would know that, right, this means we're going to go and do the shooting drill. But of course, I would randomly allocate that so that it did not become predictable. And what I did by understanding where they were coming from was not push them, but just pull them with me. And the analogy always goes, this is one of my favorite analogies in the world. It's like fishing, but when you catch them, you don't pull, you walk slowly towards them. You walk slowly towards them. Because the moment you pull on a group of young lads from an inner urban area who've never had anyone to guide them, who perhaps don't really understand what unconditional love is from someone who isn't one of the primary caregivers, the moment you pull, you just lose the line. And then you lose them. And I think this is one of the biggest problems that football in the modern era doesn't understand. When they go out, clubs go out, they spend 80 million on a young English left winger, shall we say, who has recently departed for a German club. There are huge implications of the way they behave and the way you can manage them, because it's not black and white. It really, really isn't.
Really interesting. And one thing that I wanted to bring you back to was just on your overview of how you got to the position that you're in now. You mentioned the words, you got lucky. Why do you think you got lucky in that respect?
I think I got lucky because from a young age, I had one or two people who gave me the guidance to let me know what directions were available and to give me that allure. So, shall we say? So from when I was 17, I had a godfather, not a rich man who was a civil servant who lived in India with his partner. And he was made godfather by my parents. Very, very lucky decision. He was the caregiver of my father whilst he was in care himself. And he paid for a ticket for me to go to India. And it opened my mind. And I was 17 on a plane to India. And I don't know if anyone's ever done this trek, but you go from Manchester to Dubai to India. And I didn't have any money, bear in mind. I come from a very poor background, but my parents had always encouraged adventure, shall we say, for good and for bad, you know. A part of it to get out of the house. But let's be honest. But that turning up to India when I was 17 and just being completely and utterly blown away. You know, some people describe taking large amounts of psychedelics and then their brain reforming. When you're 17, you still have that plasticity, that ability to change in your brain. When I landed in India and I arrived at the airport, I arrived in Dubai, and I've never been to an airport before, so I'm like, what is this, right? Where do I go? I didn't have money to buy anything in the airport. So then, arrive in India, and on the plane to India, nobody is white. Okay, Christy? Which I don't have a problem with. I'm just stating that from a 17-year-old lad looking around, going, what is going on? A flight attendant's like, oh, you're brave. From me being like, I'm stupid, I'm not brave. Landing in India, and what they do in certain airports in India is when you get off the plane, immediately, as soon as you go down the step, they give you a ticket. Give you a number. And then when you exit the airport, you need to give the number. and holding on to this number, being like, if I don't get there, give this to the person, I'm going to never be able to get out to the airport. But then exiting and just being blown away, and that reformatting my brain completely in a way whereby it opened possibilities and it let me know that there were possibilities available in the world. And I was very, very lucky because this £300 flight paid for by my godfather could easily not have came about.
I think in that respect, you're kind of stripped of ego and stripped of everything that you formed as an individual in Liverpool, and going into a new environment where you said that you're completely, a new person and kind of the odd one out possibly as well, because you're a white male in a very diverse country. Do you think that experience has shaped you to maybe be in the position you are now in terms of working in Europe and coming out your comfort zone and trying to apply your practice in different environments?
Yeah, definitely. I think it let me know that the culture we have within the UK or within Europe is just one of many cultures. Yeah. And the world is so rich and abundant and wonderful that just focusing on that one thing is almost like you're missing something. There are people who go to restaurants and they pick up the menu and they order the same thing again and again and again. And I'm not one of those people. I will intentionally choose something I've never eaten before. So, yeah, you've definitely hit the nail on the head. It reformats you as a person.
What's your opinion on British culture as a whole? Because I always ask this question when I interview people from across Europe and kind of people studying culture as well. What's your thoughts on British culture when you think of, that very working class, masculine identity, as we mentioned, and can't show weakness, and factors around alcohol and all these different things that we do within our culture that obviously has an impact on sport and football. What do you think on it as a whole? I'm just interested on your perspective since you've kind of relocated elsewhere.
I think culture is incredibly important within any environment, and you can get macro cultures such as the culture as a whole or a country as a whole, or even within a club there will be cultures there, such as one of the cultures I love here in Spain is that everybody says hello to everybody, and that's encouraged, and that is almost an obligation at times, and it creates a sort of horizontal hierarchy where you feel like you can speak to anyone and anyone can interact with anyone. In relation to the country as a whole, I think that from the outside looking in, at times it looks like the country is a little bit lost. It looks like culture has become a word associated with things like drinking or partying, or, for example, like I mentioned earlier on, the idea of saying to someone, what unites this person, this person, this person? Oh, we all drink tea. Well, that's not a culture. That is something you do, of course, but it's not a culture. I think that at times from the outside in, it looks like that culture is definitely a little bit lost at the moment. And of course, every country, every society will go through those phases. And I think that if you speak to people on the left or you speak to people on the right or in the centre, they will agree with that as well. They would say, yeah, we are a little bit lost in so much as that, maybe integration could be better, or maybe understanding of different types of lifestyles could be better. And the more we move forward, or the more the UK moves forward as an entity, the more it must be aware of what it is in order to move forward, because there are going to be young people from different backgrounds being placed in, no matter what the environment, be it sport or an office, and understanding each other is how we connect with each other. Mm-hmm. And I think at times there's a lack of curiosity as well, which I find quite worrisome, whereby it's okay to be curious and okay to ask questions. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are, whatever it may be, whatever slander term you may be. And I think at times that English standoffishness of being respectful is inhibiting that development.
So let me bring you back then to the situation that you mentioned. You mentioned coaching and the way that you coached at the beginning of your journey to where you're at now within Spain and psychology and working with Villareal. Talk to me about that journey from how one goes from A to B, because there might be people that are listening and watching this that are just intrigued by how that journey happens, and they might be inspired by your journey as well from the values and everything that you mentioned at the beginning. Talk to me about how you get there and what that journey looked like for you.
Sure. So at a university, I decided to head to China, and I was coaching in China, and I was doing a little bit of work also on the side, which was a little bit of teaching. I also had a stint working for the Chinese government, which was quite interesting. I've got a lot of stories that I will not be retailing here. I do not want problems with the Chinese government. So basically, when I was in China, I always had that curiosity for culture, curiosity, what makes people tick. And I think that's one arc that if anyone was ever wanting to work in different cultures, different countries, develop themselves in that way, I think that's one arc that is consistent throughout: curiosity and the ability to see things in different ways. We obviously have a very distinct style within the Premier League. However, that's not the only style that exists. That's not the only way. Because people are less tactically aware, it does not mean that they're not technically great footballers. There are some technically incredible athletes throughout the world. And whilst I was in China, you got to see that because they're very robotic. They're very robotic in the way they train. Being able to work with them and help them understand different tactical elements and that process of constantly improving my ability to put across a message. Because that's essentially the difference between the best and the rest. It's not your knowledge base. There are incredible analysts at all levels. There are incredible coaches at all levels. The difference is, can you get your information across? Because if you can't, it doesn't matter how good you are. You may as well just throw it in the bin.
Yeah. So
that I went from China. I was working a little bit there, and I was a year there, and that development really did help me understand how to do that in practical scenario. From China, I moved back to Liverpool for a little bit, continued some of the coaching. Then from there on to Seoul in Korea. And Korea was interesting in that it was a step up in level, but it was a completely different way of going about things. Koreans are very proud. Koreans are very, very, very stubborn at times. Part of the culture saving face is something that they're very well known for within Asia. However, how do you get across to someone who's doing that? How do you negate that point? How do you say to somebody, right, how do I get my point across without you feeling as if you're losing pride here? That would entail things along the lines of reminding them where their objectives are and where they want to be and what that looks like on the pitch, and really breaking those nuances down so that when we're on the pitch, okay, a good example is a player wants to start finishing at the rate of at a high rate within the box. Well, how do you control that? Well, you have to break down the process so that they understand the process. Because otherwise, you're just going to get someone who's interpreting the action the way that they've always seen fit, but they're not a coach. Korea was an incredible experience. I would advise anyone to go to Seoul, Korea, because it's an amazing place. The people are fantastic, very, very welcoming. They say it's how do they describe it? They call it the Latinos of Asia. That's how they call the Koreans, because they're very, very fiery and very, they love a pint. Love a pint. And that was amazing. And I really, really enjoyed that adventure. I really did. And popped into Japan along the way, did a little bit of coaching in Japan. And I think that understanding that completely different culture gave me the ability to see things in another way, and also improved me psychologically in that I was able to connect, to teach, to understand, and then put into practical implication of what I wanted to do in a very, very quick manner. And I think that's why I've reached where I've reached here in Spain, because if not, I'm no different to anyone else. No, I was in Korea, and I had conversations with some close people, some people I really trust, some people who were guiding me at the time. Because anyone listening to this, I advise everybody to try and find a mentor. Actively try and find somebody who can give you advice. And it's difficult because there'll be many people who are not interested in doing it. They'll just say, it's not for me. But there'll be many people who will say, okay, I'll think this on. I'll give this person advice now and again. And the amount of times I've reached out to people and just said, what do you think about this? And they've replied in a manner which is along the lines of, why are you asking me? That does happen. But every now and again, you get someone who's just willing to share something. And one of the people I was talking to at the time, goes unknown, but ex-footballer said to me, look, if you come back to the UK, you're just going to be one of many. What will distinguish you? So, okay. So I made a very difficult decision, and it was difficult to go to Spain with zero Spanish and try and start from there. And I was very lucky when I landed in Spain to make a connection quite quickly with somebody who said, okay, I know somebody who knows somebody, we can put you in touch with a club. And that club was Castellon, and they took me on board, knowing the psychological skills I had. They had one or two English players at the time, which helped, because that obviously drew interest from them. And obviously, Spain is around 33rd in the world when it comes to English, so it's not as high as it should be, especially considering the level of education here. And that was the start of a wonderful journey that I'm still thankful to this day about.
And how did you find learning Spanish in kind of, I suppose, being thrown into the deep end in some respect, if you've got to deal with players and immerse yourself in the culture and understand, how people work. And you mentioned then with your past experiences, understanding how people see things and kind of interpret things. How did you find developing Spanish skills and learning their language? How did you find that? Because we mentioned then earlier as well around culture, there's a sense of, especially in England and Britain, is that, speak English wherever you go in the world. There's an incentive not to learn a language, which I find that one of the most negative parts of our culture when we think about other countries across the world. How did you find that? I'm just interested on that.
Hugely difficult. Hugely, yeah. It was for me. It was incredibly difficult. However, I had things on my side that meant I was able to pick it up much faster than most people. When you're exposed to lots of languages over a long period, you tend to pick it up a lot quicker because your brain is constantly searching for the connections between languages. Mm. So being in China, Japan, Korea, India, here and there, I've been exposed constantly to what's happening, what's being said. That in combination with I'm a planner, Christy. I do a lot of planning. I do a lot of research. So before training, I would already have a very complete idea of what was happening in relation to the pitch, in relation to the exercises, the size of the pitch. Obviously, the pitch is still green. That helps. Oh. And then very quickly, I would... What I did whenever I reached any country, and what I still do today, is when I work with a new coach, for example, is that I have a book and I start writing the way they communicate down. I write the vernacular that they are using and the way that they describe different words and the concept that exists within their head. And by doing that, I've built up a process whereby I can understand what someone means very, very quickly and very accurately. So, and the problem is within world football, we don't have a list of words that mean the same in every country. So what does it mean, apoyo cercanas, which is close help in Spanish? But it means something very particular to each coach, because some coaches will want you to go front up because what they want to do is attract the player so that the space diagonally. Some coaches will hate that. They will want to go diagonal straight away because they want to develop rather than attract, they want to develop the passing lane. By being meticulous, I think that I was able to overcome that difficulty of language fairly quickly. I will say that the first year was very, very difficult. It was extremely difficult. There were pitfalls, there were difficulties. But after that, once I got rolling, I picked it up fairly quickly, and now obviously I work every day in Spanish, so it's just part of my everyday conversation. And actually, sometimes I think in Spanish because there are words that are more accurate in Spanish than perhaps English.
There's a real good book. A guy called Tiago Forte who's written a book called Developing a Second Brain. I don't know if you've ever come across it. And he mentions the element of just reflection and writing stuff down. And it just really reminded me of it when you mentioned the process of preparation and writing stuff down and the way that people might say certain things, just kind of aligned with what that book says. Where did you learn that skill then in terms of reflection and preparation? I'm just interested in how that became like an element of your character and your ability to work effectively. Was that learned by observing others, mentors, education? I'm just interested in how, attention to detail is very much part of who you are as a practitioner.
Yeah, so I would say between the ages of 11 and 16, I lived in a constant state of survival for one reason or another that we don't really need to go into. And that state of survival, not literal survival, more psychological survival. I wasn't finding minerals in the Congo, shall we say. You have to put everything in context. However, there were extreme difficulties, and due to those extreme difficulties, I developed the ability to constantly reflect on my words and what other people were saying and interpret what they meant. Because if I didn't, there would be problems. So that was one reason. And the other reason is because around the age of 14, between the ages of 14 and 18, I was addicted to reading. And we often use the word addiction in a very liberal way, but I was quite literally addicted to reading. I would read as many books as possible, and I would have 7 books at one time happening. And obviously the libraries helped me with that because there was no way I was going to be able to go to Waterstones anytime within that period. And I became obsessed with understanding people and the reasons that they do things and the ways in which we can interpret behaviour, but not only that, get across our messages. We all communicate in certain ways that we built up just via watching others. This is not an organic process that's happening here. This is a process of observing, taking it on, and seeing if it works. The classic line of, that's not who I am. Who you are is absolutely irrelevant. Who you are is just a collection of experiences. So when I was younger, I always had that in mind, and I obsessively studied people, not because I wanted to manipulate them or anything like that, which is often the label given to psychologists. It's just because I wanted to understand and then improve my current situation. And that's where I developed many of the skills that I have even to this current day. And it was just out of a state of survival more than anything else.
Yeah, real interesting. There's a good book as well on that. Again, you just kind of reminded me of it. A guy called Jay Shetty, reading like practicing like a monk or behaving like a monk, I think it's called. And there's a real famous quote on it: "I am what you think I am," and it very much relates to what you said then in terms of our perceptions and how we emulate behaviours, and also our ego factors of we perceive to be someone, but we only are a person based on what other people think of us, and those collection of behaviours. It just really aligned with what you said then. I think it's interesting.
100%. You, whether it's a player on a training pitch or whether it's your family, your experiences with them define how they see you, and the way that you choose to interact with them and the way that you choose to put across with them. We have huge structures within sport. However, we have very few people who are dedicated to things like culture within clubs. I think within each sport organisation, there should be a cultural minister, somebody who sits down and looks, what is the culture here? And by culture, I mean the way people interact, the way people define success, the way in which we greet each other day by day, the way in which we introduce players to the team. All of those things have huge resonance around the effect of what will happen in the future and the way they define about whether a club is their home or not. Many of these young lads, they come into clubs and they'll be there for many years, and at the age of 16 they decide, we'll go on to the next club. That's for a reason. Something has happened. Somebody needs to be sitting down and doing a very, very good, long, hard look at themselves. However, doing very hard looks at yourselves in the mirror isn't a common thing within our society these days.
Yeah, definitely. It's hard to kind of tell people certain things as well within that, which is a challenge, especially in football, because it's very dog eat dog as well. Very competitive in terms of players, but also staffing as well. And I had a conversation a couple of weeks back around kind of welfare within football, and there's an emphasis maybe on focusing on staff development within that practice and how that aligns with culture as well, in terms of how you can maybe redefine certain things and have a different outlook on certain things. Is very much missed from an educational point of view, which was something that we spoke about. And I think that kind of aligns with your point around how we develop people to help others as well, and that collective nature of becoming successful with whatever success is.
100%. Whenever I talk to coaches, they will inevitably talk to me about sports psychology for the entire time we speak. And I'm happy to do that. However, I don't define myself as a sports psychologist. I'm a coach who knows a lot about psychology, who's an expert in psychology. And the reason I look at it that way is because it's on the pitch where you can capture people. That's what they want. That's what the young lads, what the adults, that's what they want. They want somebody who understands them on the pitch. And then once you get them on the pitch, that's when you can get them off the pitch. And we have this huge disconnect within the pitch and off the pitch. We have clinical psychologist, coach. Well, the main motivation is the pitch. So, player comes off the pitch, speaks to clinical psychologist. There's a huge disconnect. And I think that's why I recently did a TIFO podcast, and I was mentioned in the Athletic. And the reason that is because people are suddenly starting to come to awareness that if we want to breed a generation of self-regulating, self-disciplined young men who understand responsibility and don't go out of a weekend crashing cars or don't need to be dating Instagram models, so to speak, then what we need to do is really tap into a different core. We need to create different structures. We need to have longevity throughout their process.
Yeah.
And that's in coaching as well. And I think that used to exist in the 80s and the 90s. It really did. And, we have the boot room at Liverpool, for example, whereby there was this longevity throughout. And we're losing it. We're losing it. But I think now we're coming back to the idea that's important. Maybe 0.5% less as a coach and 90% more as a psychologist is going to help the player in the long run.
How do you find working as a kind of that role within Europe then? And the reason I ask that is if you think of other disciplines, sports science, S&C, it's very objective, data-driven. Obviously with psychology, there's so many different variables, so many things can happen. So it's hard to kind of quantify, I think, personally, psychology. So there's a different outlook towards it then. That can bring its positives, but also its challenges as well, because people might not necessarily see it as an important factor. And I think, historically we have seen that. It's only through recent years the emergence of awareness within mental well-being, and that we've seen psychology being more figural within a certain football club or a certain industry. How do you find that in terms of your role and trying to communicate around certain things and maybe change certain things to improve and enhance performance? I'm just interested on that from your current position at the moment, and if there's any differences that you've come across.
Look, one of the main differences I've came across, I was speaking to a coach at a Premier League club fairly recently, and we were talking about the hierarchy. And here in Spain, there's a lot less at the top, shall we say. So there'll be a lot less people who are in controlling positions. And the reason that is because they will allocate that to the teams. So I don't really like talking about this, to just give you an idea. All of the teams within the club that I currently work in will have a sports psychologist. All of the teams. That is very, very rare in football.
Yeah.
It's very, very rare. The reason it's very rare is because perhaps the allocation is at different levels. But here in Europe, especially in Spain and Portugal, we view the day-to-day interaction as being one of the most important things we can do. Now, of course, we have different issues. Portugal is one of the countries that has the least crime in the world, to give you an idea. It's different issues, different situations. But that day-to-day interaction is more important than that hierarchical guidance. Within my role, I find my role an absolute delight, and the reason is because I'm able to see exactly what the head coach wants, and I work in line with him. So it's not that we have a situation of a pyramid. We're on the same page. And because of the respect of my position, because of the respect that I am a football coach as well. You find coaches immediately buy into it, because my agenda isn't an agenda. My agenda is just, I want the team to be on the peak performance possible, which is exactly the same as the coach. So within a training session, you will see me and you will just think, that's another coach. It will not look any different, but whereby I will comment on the profiling of a player, whether they are orientated correctly to the ball or not. And will also at the same time question why they are not communicating a certain instruction to the next line, why they are not taking responsibility for that action. One of the classic examples I get, one of the things I do in everyday training, is that I will say to players, do not pass the ball from centre-back to midfield without telling them what to do. Why? Because what I want to build as a coach sports psychologist is a player who takes responsibility for their actions and acts as a leader. You have to take responsibility because you're the one at the back who can see everything. By doing that, we're working on their scanning, their inhibition. We're working on people would classically describe as decision making. We're working on their ability to take responsibility within training. And then by that, we create a collective organism where everybody's taking responsibility for their own actions. Not he or she. No, me. I did this wrong. Sorry. Right, okay, we've automatically passed into the next phase. And I won't go through all of the phases that I've created, but that's just one small idea to show you how coaching and psychology are inherently linked and how we need to change the culture on that.
What does success look like for you in your practice then? what does, you mentioned those different characteristics within a certain practice, outside of the growth of a player in an individual, what does success look like for you? How do you know that you've done your job well, Kris? Is there anything that you reflect upon over the course of the year that you think is relevant for you?
Autonomy of players. If a player can build personal autonomy, the ability to self-regulate, self-discipline, inhibit themselves, that means the ability to select the right passes, understand the coach's instructions, communicate with the coach at the same time, have healthy debates within training, as in, at the same time as a player is playing, talking at the same time. The amount of training sessions, because I will actively go to different academies and I will watch, the amount of training academies that do silent training sessions. If you want to create an autonomous person, they have to have one of their main abilities, communication. And that depends on the culture, of course, but the ability to disagree without argument, the ability to affirm without subservience. All of these things create a player who is constantly thinking and constantly analysing. And that's why Spanish players are so far ahead when it comes to tactical flexibility, because they're constantly cognitively challenged. And Spain's knew this for the last 20 years. And that's why Spanish players, whether it be Rodri, or whether it be Pau Torres, two players who came out of the Villareal Academy, may I add, or whether it might be, for example, the past echelons of the Xabi Alonso's or Xavi and Iniesta. You watch them playing football and they don't look flustered. Busquets, they do not look flustered because they are not, because they are cognitively stable. They are watching, observing, monitoring. They are controlling themselves in the moment. I'm going to pass there. No. Okay, no problem. I will turn and play into space. And I think that's when you reach the top echelons, that's where the difference is. Of course, athleticism is important, and in the modern game, as important as ever. But when you see players in the Premier League, such as Phil Foden, such as Harvey Elliott, such as young players such as
Bellingham.
Kwanzaa. Well, Bellingham's a monster, isn't he? Bellingham's a physical monster as well. But what I'm trying to get at is when you concentrate on those players who perhaps are not the most physically gifted, they can still come through because of their brain. Alvarez is another one at Manchester City. And I think that Spanish clubs have understood this Spanish and Portuguese clubs have understood this for a very long time, and understood that positions like mine are incredibly important. Whilst I have conversations with Premier League clubs, and often I'm wondering, I think you're just haven't cottoned on just yet.
Well, one thing that I would say to challenge that is it easy said than done to try and think about different ways of playing and ways of training from other cultures and other countries and bring that into the UK? Obviously, I always find, and this is personal perception, if France win the Euros or if someone wins the World Cup, what do they do in terms of their academy systems? Let's bring that into English football. If the Dutch are playing with no goalkeepers, let's bring that into English football. And I think sometimes it's easier said than done. We mentioned at the beginning of a kind of, if you look at, again, France for the beginning, street football and all those cultural aspects, and even with Spain, with like futsal and cage football, and it's just different, do you know what I mean? And then sometimes I always find that when we see and replicate and highlight these fantastic things that you mentioned that you're doing and trying to merge that into the UK or other kind of systems, it's not as black as white as we think. Do you get what I mean when I say that?
I will challenge you back. And say Alan Shearer, Les Ferdinand, Robbie Fowler, Michael Owen, Ian Wright, right? We're talking 5 world-class strikers, all learned playing football on the street. All of them. There's the stories of Ian Wright playing down a local park on the street wherever he could. There was a recent podcast that talked about exactly that, about the lack of English strikers. I think that we used to do that, which is my point when we began with the 80s and 90s. We used to do that. Paul Gascoigne was a street footballer who was incredible on the pitch because he had more space and he had that tight control. Glenn Hoddle. We can go on and on and on, and the best British players have all been street footballers. Jude Bellingham is a street footballer. He's a street footballer who's able to extend it into extension. Musiala, who came through the British ranks, street footballer. I think I agree with you what you're saying. You have to be careful when you bring in things. However, we know that when we studied the French system, when we built St. George's Park, we saw the advantages that had and the leap that had when I think it's Charlemagne, I think it is the place in France. But that might be an ex-emperor, so apologies about that if I'm absolutely slating the French language. But what I'm trying to say is, yes, I agree that you need to keep your own culture, but I actually think that was our culture and we lost it. And I think the reason we lost it is because if you look in Spain, if you look in France, there's street pitches all over the place. We've lost that within the inner urban areas, and clubs in the UK are beginning to notice that. There's a club from the Midlands who've just launched an academy within the city, and they just have small pitches. They just have small pitches because they know that is going to have a huge benefit. So yes, I agree with you. It is important to maintain your own culture, but at the same time, I think that we actually came from that as well. You know, to talk about my position, how many ex-assistant managers used to be the connector between the manager and the team? That used to be the job of the assistant manager, which is essentially what I do. But now it's more based around the lines of analyst or coach who's very meticulous. So I think that we've just veered away from what was working in order to look actually toward the European model in itself. And it was working because we 1996, for example, or 1998, we had an incredible team of footballers who arguably underachieved.
It's an interesting concept. I don't know if you had a look at south of the river, the Crystal Palace. I think it was Crystal Palace, but there's this emphasis on where Crystal Palace is located, south of the river in London. Very populated, dense areas. A lot of cages within that area in comparison to anywhere else in the UK. If you look at all the footballers that have come through the system there, there's like Zaha, Antonio, Balassi, Ferdinand. There's loads of players that have come through that because of their upbringing. It's just interesting how that aligns with, okay, well, what do we need to do what are the characteristics of a footballer, do you know what I mean, in terms of how we can have this rawness and emerge that through obviously some of the practices that you mentioned there. But we could be here debating it all day, right, Kris?
100%. And I'm not saying that. I always say about these things, I reserve the right to be wrong, because that's definitely possible. But I do think that if you build the installations, you will always see an uptick in ability. You will always see an uptick in people playing football. And that's why countries like Brazil, because everybody plays, there's a field all over the place in Brazil where people are playing football. I think it was Iceland, a team of theirs reached the group stage of the Conference Cup fairly recently. And they actively saw an uptick as soon as they built pitches that could be played in all weather. And there's a really good little documentary about that, about the idea of how they created the culture, what they went about doing it. And like you say, in parts of south of the river, if you create it, they will come. And then it's how you mold them. Then it's how you create that culture.
So final few questions then, Kris. So what's the future hold for you then? So you mentioned all these different experiences that you've had working in Asia, and then kind of coming back to the UK and then coming back to Europe and kind of using those lessons and applying that within your practice. What's the future hold for you in terms of your adventure and obviously your coaching and your role within the kind of the psychological area at the moment? Is there anything that you've set out for yourself that you want to achieve?
Yeah, definitely. So I set out when I arrived in Spain, I wanted to make it to a La Liga club, and I achieved that. And I'm very, very happy with my progression. I went from the under-12 A team to now the under-17 and the under-19s, which, to give you an idea, is not very common. It's not very common at all, especially as a foreigner. With my terrible accent in Spanish, I sound like a Russian sometimes. It's quite rough around the edges. But what I would say is I am very happy here in Villareal. I love the culture. The quality of life, Christy, is absolutely incredible. The people, I have fantastic working relationships with beautiful people who understand what I do and respect it. And they're able to give me that license to express myself within training sessions, and they can see the benefit. Every coach I work with, they will sit down with me, assign a role, and they will say, well, want to do this, and then they will ask me, how do we go about it? So I think that I'm very, very happy here. Of course, I would love to have other adventures in the future. What that will be, it depends, because I think that whenever I have these type of conversations, the first thing people label me as is just a psychologist. When I have the UEFA A, I have the Spanish Pro, I have more experience coaching than most people in many different environments and at elite levels, shall we say. So it really depends on the footballing universe. If someone is listening to this and can see what I do and then thinks, wow, okay, that could be applied, then we'll see. But of course, if I was to go to Scandinavia, for example, or back to the UK, it would have to be in a position where the people around me believed in what I was doing, because otherwise I would just stay in Spain and work in a fantastic club with fantastic people for the foreseeable future.
I suppose it's process-orientated goals rather than, objective-orientated goals or extrinsic goals. I think that's kind of the full process in terms of, am I learning, am I developing people around me? Is that right?
100%. It's not, for me, it's not about, I want to make it to a Premier League club within 5 years. I want to be working with the first team. No. To be honest with you, I would rather work with an under-19s team and feel valued and a part of the team than go sign for some Premier League team and have 5 minutes with the players because they label me just as a psychologist.
Yeah.
For me, it's the quality of what I do, the quality of life, the quality of everything involved is just as important as the other things. Status is not everything.
But it goes back to that point around status and ego, as we mentioned when you went to India and being stripped of that and understanding the perceptions of that. Very much goes back to that point. Do you know what I mean? And how that might impact obviously your future process. But like I said, Kris, and even for our conversation today, I love your ambition, I love your work rate and energy, and good luck with that. And hopefully that still proceeds and you continue to learn and grow.
We'll see. Well, thank you very much for your time, Christy. I really appreciate the opportunity. I think that not many people are willing to have these open and lovely dialogues. And thanks for the opportunity of giving me the ability to present myself. I apologise if I made any mistakes. I've been fasting for the last couple of days and I'm honestly on my last legs. So I'm sorry if I slurred my words at any moment.
Kris, thank you for your time. Cheers.